Greg Allman that once stated, if you took 1,000 people randomly and just put them into a city that they had no clue to live, that the musicians that are just a small fraction would be the first people to kind of congregate and start communicating. I like to think that's true. For the first time, I'm noticing that Linux and Music has appeared twice in FSOS, and I hope that this doesn't, this is a continuing trend. We'd like to present the afternoon presentation for the FSOS, and to introduce you to Blaise Aline. Blaise is a graduate from the University of Toronto, Bachelor of Science, but what a resume and what a background. Founding a member of Planet Libre, if I'm not correct. If I'm correct, I should say. And plus an extensive musical background. And from what I gathered, you have created a nice, cool rig here that not only are you demonstrating to us, but has been used before in productions, including CBC, which is or some television.
CTV, yeah, part of it at least, yeah.
Absolutely fascinating. Blaise, I met last year because I did a quick demo on music, and a very keen and amazing individual. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Blaise on this topic.
Thank you.
reaching for me now. Through the dark, reaching for me now. Need someone to hear you when you sigh. Someone to wipe away those tears you cry. Someone to hold you neath the darkened sky. Someone who loves you more than I. Love you, girl. I love you more than I can say. I love you, girl. I love you more than I can say. Even with my heart in the way.
So Many Wires. That was a song by a songwriter named Alexei Murdoch. Song that I've been listening to a lot recently, a favorite of mine. And one of the first songs that I tried as a solo artist on my live music rig, because it's such a raw, bare acoustic track, but on the recorded version, there's just this soundscape behind it, and that was the first song I tried to arrange here to create that soundscape live. So I'll walk you through what I did to create that song as an entry point into this live music rig. So we had 3 instruments going. The synth, which went somewhere. Well, there was the synth. Oh, I muted it. That would do it. So the synth was the first instrument. That's coming from my MIDI keyboard, plugged in via USB and going through a software synth called Yoshimi. This allows me, the MIDI controller sends MIDI notes, and I can play make any kind of sounds with that. So I picked one that worked for that tune. And the next sound was the guitar. Now the guitar is going through my pedal board here, but I'm only actually using one of the effects, which is the pitch shifter, to get those slides and to get it up high. All the other sound processing is taking place in Rack here on the computer. With this angel chorus sound. So I can get all kinds of different sounds out of this. For example, it's a pretty straight sound, or so the guitar is feeding through there, and that's what's coloring it with all of those effects. And then the violin was just going raw. That's not what I wanted. The violin was just going raw. But all of these tracks were going through Super Looper, which is a kind of digital audio workstation for live looping. So 3 tracks there, violins in the middle, right? So I lay down one track, and then I just layer some violin on top of it. And that's the same thing that I did with the synth, and the same thing that I did with the guitar. This pedal I just bought a couple days ago, because the last time I was trying to do this for a presentation a month back for Software Freedom Day in Toronto, I was clicking everything. So this is a MIDI foot controller. So it also plugs in via USB, but I can program this so that this starts and stops the loops. Or at the beginning when I was looking really confused there, I started the violin loop, but I was playing guitar, so there was nothing coming out after I finished, and I was trying to figure out what was going on. So luckily I programmed the undo button into the pedal too, so I was able to just rewrite and just reset that. So this gives me a lot of the software controls, but within reach of my feet, so I don't need to be on my laptop when I'm performing. There's some other really cool things, like for example, well, let's step down the stack. So they're all going into Super Looper, but before that, I'm using Jack, which you would have heard about if you were at the presentation earlier on home recording. Jack is the audio server for professional audio in GNU Linux, and it's available for OS X as well. So this is my Jack patch bay. I'm using a program called Cadia, and you can see that all the blue are audio inputs, all the red are MIDI. So all these applications that are Jack aware can define any number of audio inputs and outputs, any number of MIDI inputs and outputs. So I have coming in from my launch key, the MIDI keyboard, that goes into Yoshimi, and then that audio goes into loop number 1 of Super Looper and out to my keyboard bass amp, which is playback 1. The guitar comes in from Capture 2 into Rack, and then Rack goes into loop 2, and that goes into my electric guitar amp. And the violin in Capture 1 just goes straight in and then straight out to my guitar amp. And my foot pedal is sending MIDI signals to Super Looper for this, so I can stop it, but I also have it plugged in to Rack, so I can change the effects with my foot as well. So this is a graphical interface for Jack. When you're setting up GNU Linux Audio, there can be a lot of complicated stuff. So one of the easiest things to do is to find an audio distro that does a lot of that for you. So Ubuntu Studio was the first one that I used. More recently, there's KX Studio and AV Linux. What I'm doing now is I'm just running Debian Jessie, but I have the KX Studio repository. So KX Studio offers a complete distro, but also repositories for Debian and Ubuntu. So with the KX Studio repositories, I have the latest, greatest audio production software, and some of the kind of preset configuration things. And the only thing I had to get on my own was a low latency kernel, which I got from the Licorix project. So install that kernel, install the KX Studio repositories, and I'm good to go in Debian. Though if you're starting fresh, it's worth looking at KX Studio proper or AV Linux or Ubuntu Studio, something that's going to pre-configure the system so that you don't need to fight with this the first time. And then coming down to the lower hardware level, for professional audio production, you want to have an audio interface to replace your onboard sound card. So this is the one that I'm using here, and that's what Jack is communicating with. So that's where I get my two system inputs, my two system outputs, where I've got my master volume going in and out of the amps. And for a lot of this hardware, the key thing that you're looking for is whether or not it's USB class compliant. If it's USB class compliant, you don't need any fancy drivers for it. You don't need any proprietary drivers. It's going to work well. It's very likely to work well in GNU Linux. So I have a class compliant audio interface, a class compliant MIDI keyboard, a class compliant MIDI foot controller. So they all are plug and play with Jack in GNU Linux.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
It's great when musicians marry with programmers, right? Programming skills. I was curious about your disaster recovery. Like, have you ever had a problem with some technology, whatever, a little glitch? And how do you? You're live, right? So how do you deal with that? Have you ever had to deal with it?
Yeah. Well, I'm still relatively new in a performance setting to using the system, so that's something that I'm like. That's why I programmed I programmed 4 buttons into the controller 2 days ago, and undo was one of them. Yeah, when I was on CTV Canada AM in March, I was accompanying another artist that I play with. I didn't have the whole rig. I just had the keyboard and the laptop and the sound card. And I was there during sound check, like checking a million times. Like, okay, still working? All right. Still working? Okay, good. And then
it's interesting. I mean, Ed Sheeran was my introduction to looping, right? But he uses just an appliance. It's simple. He's probably not an IT literate guy, but he's a talented musician, and he uses what he uses to create a big sound effect that he puts on stage. But you've got lots of complexity there, which is great to see that marriage, but it also creates some potential exposure.
Yeah, it's a total exposure in that way. It has to be something that I need to be prepared to troubleshoot. With live looping though, a lot of the troubleshooting is more to do with workflow than technology. So if I have the right, I have to do some extra work to program the right buttons in for Super Looper versus if I had a self-contained looping device. But a lot of the troubleshooting is workflow. Like if you need to redo a loop, what do you do in different contexts? And that's something that I'm still new to and learning. But when I've seen other people do that, like when I've been I was on tour with somebody who was doing a lot of live looping with his cello, and he got a new pedal, so he was practicing during sound check, so he didn't hit the wrong button. But it's just a workflow thing, so that if you make this mistake in this context, what are your options?
Yeah, it's Nassau. It's like your alias. It's what are the steps, right, to
get
out of the jam.
Yeah, and it's different depending on the kind of thing you're doing. Like with an atmospheric loop like that, it doesn't need to be so precise. The loops don't need to be in sync. I want them to be out of sync, right? I want them to be mixing in a different way. But a song that I'll play in a little bit is a much tighter loop, so we'll see how that one goes. Let me demo a little bit more of this software. So one of the so this is really an alpha state. Like I've used pieces of this before in production, but this is a very new thing. This is the second time that I've brought this whole rig out together somewhere. And one of the things that I am gradually learning to do is to put more and more control at my fingertips and trying to figure out what controls I actually need. So so this is another synth program that I was using, and I've got some knobs and sliders on my launch key MIDI controller as well. So if we grab, say, this, I am playing in a band that's just in the early stages of jamming, so it may or may not be a thing, but trying to get some control here, mid-song with the song we were working on a couple weeks ago. I've programmed some things like the portamento to the keyboard, so I have it at my fingertips, like to the MIDI keyboard, so I don't have to go back to my laptop. So I can have a little bit of that slide sound, right? Like, but then just drop it out and just have something straight and clear. So something that I can adjust a second, or even drive, right? So I could kick in, like. Just having some of that control at my fingertips. It's more work when you don't buy a self-contained box that has all that thought that goes into getting a preset. But the kind of thing that I'm doing is I'm looking at, okay, what do the preset things have? What kind of controls do people need at their fingertips? And what kind of controls do I want at my fingertips for my workflow? And sort of just in the early stages of kind of adjusting and getting those settings. One of the other really neat things is when you bring the laptop in the mix is the decoupling of the controller from the sound processing. So when you have a MIDI controller, you're playing the notes on one device, but the sound is being processed in another. So I just switched to a totally different software application. It opens up the potential for a lot of interesting things. So for example, with Rack-A-Rack. Also, so there's software synths which generate a sound, but there are also sound processors which modify a sound. So this is both of those things at the same time. So I can take my violin and put it through a sound processor like Rack-A-Rack, except I have to put it through a sound processor like Rack-A-Rack. Rack-A-Rack, where are you? So let's adjust this effect so it is all wet, no dry. So that's really cool. And then even cooler is this has a software feature to try and pick up the MIDI note from the sound that's coming in. So I can pipe the MIDI out from Rack-A-Rack. So I've got the audio going through, but I'm going to take the MIDI out, and I'm going to throw that into that AM synth. So this, but maybe quieter. So now, and it's chaotic, but it can be controlled. So I can adjust the trigger and the velocity, I think. So that's the kind of stuff that I'm playing around next for the future. The possibilities of kind of anything, any input going into any output, of decoupling the controller from the instrument. So I can try and harness my violin as a MIDI controller. That is a really cool potential for this sort of thing. Music and technology have been pretty separate for me until the last year. I've always been interested in technology. I've always been interested in music, but there were few overlaps between the two, except for maybe home recording, because most of the music that I was interested in was more analog music, more folk music or rock music or things like that. So I did music over here, I did computers over here. People were like, "Oh, you're interested in both. Why don't you do techno music?" And that was not interesting to me. I've more recently got into EDM, but before those were two separate worlds. When in my software life, when I discovered GNU Linux at U of T in a comp sci program, and then heard Richard Stallman speak, I turned around, left Windows behind, started replacing everything with free software, and then eventually you start getting to the specialized programs, and that's when I hit the recording software, and that's when I went to Ubuntu Studio several years back and kind of figured out, okay, how can I set up my home studio so that I can record? But that was kind of that. But a year ago, I started looking for keyboards, because I'm a multi-instrumentalist. I am a solo songwriter, but I accompany other songwriters a lot. So I'm on violin or guitar. I thought it would be an asset to be able to have a keyboard or maybe a piano at home, things like that. And I started looking into them, and my frame of reference at first was the Nords, because they're like, the ultimate kind of stage piano keyboard, and it would be nice to have something that has piano sounds but also synths. But that's when I really opened my eyes to MIDI, because I had just had this misconception about MIDI as cheap computer sounds before, and I realized that it's more of an any input to any output kind of universal language. And all of a sudden, when I discovered that, and I discovered the free software options for working with it, the Nord just started looking like a big MacBook, like this kind of device that's shiny and works really well and is a little overpriced, but you can't tinker with it. You can't get inside. It's a big black box. So that's when I totally shifted and went to the MIDI route and just dove headfirst into GNU Linux audio. And the idea to create the live music station, I was starting to do this in terms of a keyboard. I should also demo another kind of program. I showed you sound processors to modify the sound, and software synthesizers to generate a sound from the computer. But there are also samplers. So samplers allow MIDI notes to trigger the sound, but then it plays back pre-recorded audio. So I can use a sampler to make my MIDI controller play the piano as well. So if we do this, so I realized that with a MIDI controller, I would have all these options combined with my laptop. Instead of buying all these specialized pieces of hardware that could do one thing really well, but you couldn't really transform into something else. Same with the controller. This was an expensive purchase earlier this week, but this can replace, this can be a looping pedal. This can control guitar effects. This can serve multiple purposes. It's not one dedicated piece of hardware that does only one thing. I can reconfigure it to do multiple things and to serve multiple purposes. So when I started realizing that, as a multi-instrumentalist and as a solo artist, I started thinking about the potential of bringing this together and bringing it outside. Like I've spent the entire day today carting around half the contents of my apartment here, but being able to do that, right? To bring my studio out from home live with me on a stage, to be able to accompany myself, to lay down a soundscape like that, the kind of thing that I was already doing in the studio, but I saw a way to do it live, and I saw a way to do it as a sideman, like in this band that we're just at the jam stage now. It's a 5-piece. We have vocals, bass, drums, kind of more traditional electric guitar, keys, and my role is like computers. Like I'm the which is never a role that I've had before. I'm usually the violinist or maybe the guitarist, but I'm kind of like the Swiss Army knife of special ops and other kinds of sounds, right? So bringing all this kind of stuff and being able to do a wide variety of things, and to have a setup that I can separate a bit. Like I don't need to bring the whole setup everywhere. I could just bring the keyboard. I could just have the foot controller to be able to loop acoustic guitar. For example, well, yeah. Let me play a couple songs to show this concretely. This next tune is called Canvases. This is the first original tune that I started arranging for this setup, and by arranging for this setup I mean last night. And I think when I get more comfortable with the gear, I'll probably do more, but it shows at least what's already possible at a simple level. I also said I would play some free culture tunes. So the first one was a cover, but this one is licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution Share Alike license. Free as in freedom.
In a minute I'll be there. I'll make it worth the wait. So rest your head in mine. Sleep and forget time. Say you're always mine. I'll be there. Know you're gorgeous in this light. Reflections in your eyes summon me to life, to celebrate your smile, to witness the beauty of your embrace. If I could paint voices calling out your name. I'd create 100 canvases, none of them the same. If I had the strength to alleviate all of your pain, you might be repaid. These unknown voices calling out your name. I'd create 100 canvases, none of them the same. None of them the same. If I had the strength to alleviate all of your pain. If I had the strength to alleviate all of your pain. You might be repaid.
So that was messy when you see the idea about what's possible. Let me show you a few demos for where I see, a few videos for the kinds of things that I see as next steps moving forward, and then I'll play one last song. So first of all, I've never done any hardware hacking before, and I've never had any real interest beyond curiosity about the Arduino until I saw this. So he's not using free software, he's using Max MSP on a Mac, but he's using free hardware, and the point is he's doing two things. One, he's put controls at his fingertips on guitar, so we could start a loop. He's got drum samplers there. So one, that's MIDI controls at his fingers. But two, the second thing he did is his guitar was going through the proprietary sound processing program to get the effects, and he was modifying that effect from the Arduino sensors. So the kind of vibrato and the changes to that effect live as he was going, he had that control not through a MIDI foot controller or through knobs here, but modified on his guitar so he could use his hands like an extended whammy pedal that reaches through his computer. So that is cool.
Is that similar to when you're playing the violin and having your software detect the MIDI key and triggering the synthesizer?
Not quite, because it's still the same sound from the guitar that's going through. It's just the effects that the software is putting on it. He can change the vibrato or change the nature of the effect, but it's not changing the guitar to MIDI. It's just, instead of, it's more similar to when I was twiddling knobs while I was playing keyboard, but he's able to do that on guitar by, like with his wrist, basically. Also, Arduino potential.
Hey, I'm going to show you how to build an electronic output. Basically,
Not going to go through the whole video, but
the underside, you see them, touch link.
she puts a xylophone together with Arduino sensors, and it's just a MIDI instrument, right? So it's just another controller. That controller is decoupled from the sound processing. So you can create your own custom MIDI controllers and then hook it in to whatever kind of software, right? How you play the instrument is different from how it sounds. And this is something else super interesting to that effect. This is a super proprietary thing from Roland, but it is a pickup on there. It's going through Roland sound processing, but you can actually use that pickup and get a MIDI output. And it's getting each string on the guitar and translating that to MIDI notes. So this guy can play guitar and get piano sampled sounds out, just like I...
Bagpipes are riot. Hearing bagpipes.
Yeah, it could be anything. It's wild, right? So it totally decouples the controller for the sound processor again. And then there's actually a relatively inexpensive one that isn't custom for a guitar. This just takes a 1/4-inch input. It can only do one note at a time. It can't do chords. But you can put any instrument in there, and it's spitting MIDI out. So this is guitar to MIDI and coming out as a saxophone, right? It's decoupled the controller from the sound processing again. And one last video here. I have one of these on pre-order.
I love using synthesizers and samples to make my music, but over time, I got tired of buying new equipment every time I wanted to do something new. There is the option of using your computer or even your mobile. Just install the app with the function you want and get the sound. But the experience is not the same as using a real foot pedal. So I thought about this device that would be flexible as the smartphones are, in which you can install any app from any developer, and at the same time would give you the experience of using a regular stop box. I introduce you to Mod Tool.
So it's virtual pedal
Is a new concept.
Yeah, it's an embedded GNU Linux computer.
Open source technology.
So it's all the kind of stuff on my laptop, but embedded in a pedal.
Mod Tool is the second generation of mod processors. It's the evolution of the mod father, or Father product, which was released last year. At first sight, it looks just like a regular pedal board. The difference is that you can connect to it live, even on your plane, and change the whole configuration. It offers you a broad interface that's friendly, intuitive, and very powerful. You can choose how to control the wheels on the highway. You can sound new ones from the mod pod with just a simple click. With extender controls, the mod lets you connect external peripherals. Hackers can even use our Arduino chip.
Arduino again.
Everything happens inside the mod, and it's possible to set up a device for offline without a computer. It's all run in a single interface in which you can configure, install new plugins, and even share pedal board with other mod users. The Ultimate was designed to receive just about any electronic instrument. All this makes the mod a truly general purpose sound processor. It adapts to your needs and evolves with you. This is the last sound processor you ever need to find. The idea.
So it's like everything that I've been doing in my laptop, but in an embedded computer that you can interact with like a foot pedal. So really excited to see the potential for that. I'm gonna play one more song here. So one of the other things I still need to figure out is how to save the settings for a song so that if I'm playing a bunch of songs, I can just go ahead and preload it. There's a few tools available to do that, but I haven't found the one that fits the right workflow yet. But it works well for this kind of talk and demo because I want to show you what's going on anyways. So let's close a bunch of stuff that we don't need. Not going to use this. I'm going to switch to a different sound processor called Guitarix for my electric guitar. And I'm using Fabla as a drum sampler for the pads on my MIDI keyboard. So let's get Guitarix going into these loops. And I think we have what we need. Let's find out. This is a tune called Bad Attraction by Brad Sucks. It's also free culture, freely licensed.
suggested, baby, that I want to be your best friend. Yeah, yeah, lines in my eye holes, I'm just trying hard to see. I can tell by your middle finger that you're going out to me. Yeah, yeah. Satisfaction, yeah. Bad attraction, yeah. Satisfaction, yeah. You got the message, but I wanna give it to you some more. Come through the window and try to show me the door. Yeah, yeah, where did my sunshine go, baby? Nobody knows. We can get together without coming to blows. Yeah, yeah. Satisfaction, yeah. Bad attraction, yeah. Satisfaction, yeah, yeah. Satisfaction, yeah. Bad attraction, yeah. Satisfaction, yeah. Bad attraction, yeah. Satisfaction, yeah. Bad attraction.
Thank you.
I'm sorry about this, but there's probably not enough time for questions, because someone has to come in, but I couldn't break up this lovely music that you've been doing. And I have a couple of questions myself, very quickly, I guess, at your expense. Number one, how much is that unit? If I'm allowed to ask.
This?
Yes.
A little under $400
Okay.
before tax.
Doable. Number two, what's the name of your band, that you think?
No band name yet. It's
So
a
you
new
heard it
experimental
here
thing.
first, no band name yet.
But if you are interested in my music, I have a mailing list. Sign up here. I'm rebooting my solo act next year with this kind of stuff, so you can find out more there. Or these are resources. If you're interested in learning more, highly recommend these. So I'll leave these on the screen while I tear down some other stuff.
Blaze, it's been a pleasure.